Hello. In this final unit of on Bollywood cinema, or as Indian cinema is popularly called today, we are going to look at the soft power of Bollywood, the soft power of Indian cinema, which I call the magic of Bollywood, at home and abroad. That's the title of my book of the same name, where I explore India's rising soft power through its culture and use Bollywood as an example. So, the magic of Bollywood examines Bollywood as a prime instrument through which Indian soft power is projected throughout the world, with a view to understanding the role that culture plays in relations between multicultural, multi-ethnic nations and societies. What's the relationship of culture to nations and national communities? How do audiences located in different nations relate and respond to shared images? And how does this lead to a better understanding of each other? These are the questions I would try to explore. The important aspect of Indian cinema is that it's a national cinema, but unlike other national cinemas, it's unique in its development into national cinema without being either state owned or state controlled. And interestingly, this disavowed cinema, a cinema which was disavowed by the state and the middle class elite until recently, became complicit in the propagation of nationalist ideologies, as Madhav Prasad has brilliantly brought out in his book, The Ideology of the Hindi Film, and became an important instrument in the production of the nation and the citizens subject of modernity. We will not go into this, since we have already spoken about the popularity of Indian cinema in the 30s in the Indian diasporas in Fiji, West Indies, Malaya, 50s in South Asia, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Thailand, Burma, Indonesia, the Middle East, Africa, Russia, and beginning in the 90s, the movement of Bollywood to Europe, North America and Australia. What I am interested in is the impact that it had on not just the Indian diasporas, for which it was considered suitable entertainment, but the impact it had, the effect it had on other ethnic groups who got hooked to the pleasures of Indian cinema when it was exported to these countries. Beginning in the 1930s, the non-Indian groups, the non-Indian diasporas, and I am not talking about South Asians, but other ethnic groups. So, the Bollywood fixation of non-South Asian viewers in Nigeria, Ghana, Malaysia and Thailand may be attributed to status interventions that enable the screening of Indian films in cinema halls and the virtual monopoly in these markets in the absence of a Hollywood incursion and the absence of a local industry. So, since there was no local industry, no indigenous industry, and Hollywood had not made inroads into these nations, Indian cinema virtually enjoyed a monopoly in these countries and became part of the national imaginary of those nations as well, such as Nigeria, for instance. So, in markets like Afghanistan, Pakistan, where the state did attempt to protect its industry and citizens from the hegemonic or corruptive influence of Bollywood by banning the import of Bollywood films, citizens devised ingenious strategies to evade state regulation by smuggling them, particularly in the 70s with the video boom and the cassette culture. We met Havara in Russia, we met Havara in China, and we have also met Havara in Turkey. Now, let's meet Mera Naam Joker in Tanzania by listening to an interview by a former resident.
lot of Malayali plays, and my parents, they did like 1 or 2 shows a year. That's how I grew up in.
So that means the Malayali community was very big.
Was very big and very creative. They came with Marxist tradition. They produced a lot of Marxist films. Ningalene Communist Archie, which means you made me a communist.
Okay.
And then there were a couple of Naxalite plays they made. And so there was a lot of this stuff going on because, it was socialist Tanzania, so Kerala politics. It was just very interesting realizing now, from the perspective where I am now, to realize.
So she's
individuals might have been
where they own land, and therefore they had to be own Punjabis and Gujaratis, and I think it's because he didn't like Malayalis too much. People who went to Bollywood. My friend, this woman, her editors was my generation people married. All the stuff going on, it was like different Malayalis dated Africans.
They might have. Individuals might have been, but the families are very close.
The families are very close.
Very close.
But the Ismailis were probably the most integrated because they spoke stuff really, really well.
Really?
And dated. So it's funny you're talking because Vasanji edited this book. So she was like, yeah, you want to stay in you can't. Tanzania was, very much connected to China. Expecting they made, and so there was a lot of this stuff going on because.
So what she's saying is this is the presence of a large Malayali community in Tanzania during this time, and I missed that part where she talks about how they would go to watch films in open air theatre in Tanzania, where they would meet with other Indian communities, and she watched Mera Naam Joker 13 times, not because she wanted to watch the film, but because of the forms of sociality that the film produced by getting the Indians together. But what interested me was that along the barbed wire or the boundary wall of the open air theatre, where Indians would be watching these films and celebrating and performing these community events and affirmations of community, there would be an entire audience of Africans, of the local African people, who would be watching the same films from outside the boundaries. Even though they couldn't follow the dialogues, or they could even not hear the dialogues, these groups of people on the periphery would be watching the same films, and this is how we're talking about the 70s. They acquired a taste for Indian films, which they still indulge in even today. And now we move to Ghana, and around the same years, but this time we don't have a diasporic person, not a person of Malayali origin, but we have a person of African, a black person from Africa, who shares his experience of having watched Sholay in a theatre.
Yes.
Okay.
I see what you can say.
We're going to start with Sholay, and whatever you remember of Sholay, Amitabh Bachchan is the central, one of the two lovable crooks, the cowboy, because that's what Slumdog and Sholay have in common.
Well, the two things that I remember from watching Sholay, which is, I must admit, is a very long time ago, is that the film seemed to play with the idea of the frontier hero, which was quite common in the Western, the tradition of the American Western. But of course, the frontier hero of the Western is a particular character type. He has to be rugged, he has to be very masculine, very strong, often also brutal, at least in the tradition of the Western. This surely plays with the idea of the frontier, except that the character that is produced in the face of this frontier is not the same as the character of the Western. It's the ruggedness is not an exclusive masculine ruggedness. It's rather the ruggedness of someone that is able, or people that are able to constantly recreate themselves. And it's for that the trickster trickster, petty criminality. So the petty criminality and the apparent tricksterhood is not a negative quality, even though the law and order system posits them as negative. In the larger schema of the film, that is the character that they require to survive on this frontier. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the frontier is not a stable frontier, unlike the western frontier, where the frontier is a landscape. It's a landscape, often desert-like. If I remember rightly, the Shole frontier changes from urban to wider landscape, and there's a theme that was running through of the train.
There was a train, and also,
there was a train which keeps moving. They have several encounters with this train. As I speaking from memory.
Yeah.
Therefore, the frontier, as marked by the train, also weaves together a certain empty landscape with a landscape that is already ordered, either ordered in terms of an urban ordering or in terms of an ordering which requires law and so on. So that these two characters are necessary for a frontier that is in motion. It's a transitional frontier, so that their tricksterhood and very cleverness and slyness and so on is what is required by this kind of mobile and elusive frontier. One might even venture to read this in a larger post-colonial vein of a city-state in formation or transformation, where the different kinds of character types that are required for different dimensions of the post-colony. I don't know. As I said, I'm speaking from vague memory. In fact, these questions actually suggest to me that I should go and revisit Shole seriously.
Those memories are very important for me, for the work I'm doing on the transnational flows of Bollywood cinema.
Okay, so here was, but we also need to see that there's a difference between the more elite response, and here we had a very informed, sophisticated analysis of Shole given by someone who's part of the educated elite of Ghana, as was the previous person of Indian origin, of Malayali origin. But the responses, apart from this class dimension, we find that there are different reasons why people seem to appreciate, why they do appreciate Bollywood films, Hindi films in different parts of the world. And now we move on to Singapore, and we meet the young couple you met again, and we have them singing for you.
Very good.
You sing it to your wife?
Sometimes.
Okay, so here we see the uses and abuses of Bollywood in different parts of the world, where this gentleman is singing Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. This young couple here we met in Jade Cinema yesterday. And now I move on to Joseph Nye's idea of soft power. His idea, which he developed in his book Bound to Lead, The Changing Nature of American Power in 1990, which he developed further in Soft Power, The Means to Success in World Politics. And he defines power as the ability to alter the behavior of others to get what you want. There are three ways to do it: coercion, payments, and attraction, which is soft power. Now, what is soft power? He opposes soft power to hard power and calls soft power the ability to get what you want, or without ordering others to do. I don't know why this has got the lines have got jumbled for the ability to get what you want others to do through attraction rather than forcing them to do what you want, and it's less transferable, less cursive, and less tangible than hard power. Now, soft power resources, according to Nye, include intangible power resources such as culture, ideology, and institutions, and it's based on cultural attraction, and it has an important role. Ideology, for instance, when we talked about American soft power, we were talking about how this ideology of consumption or freedom and liberty or the capitalist ideology has an intrinsic appeal for certain people in the world, and he thinks it's got a very important role to play in international relations. So, now using a nice idea of soft power, we find that Indian films have with a sprawling idea. Nye himself mentions this when he says Indian films with a sprawling audience across Asia, Middle East, and Africa are the cutting edge of the country's soft power. This is what he says. So he does mention India and Indian films in his understanding of his explanation of what soft power is. And then we have Shashi Tharoor. In his earlier position, he's no longer in the ministry, but in his official position, he made this lecture. He delivered a lecture in which he announced that something much less tangible, but a good deal more valuable in the 21st century may be more important than any of them, Indian culture, which is India's soft power. He compared to hard power, and he said what is important is India's soft power. And now when we talk about India's soft power, the question, we have anecdotal evidence of the popularity of Indian films in different markets across the world, and these anecdotal evidence are now being corroborated by serious research, by researchers who are compiling data on the popularity of Indian films and authenticating it through interviews, to the ethnographic work such as Brian Larkin's work on the in Benin, and in Shakuntala Rao's work in Russia. We have evidence coming from different parts of the world about and more concrete data on how many people. In this context, I must mention the work on Senegal. Senegal, which is a very interesting case because it did not have an Indian diaspora, and yet Indian films gained popularity in Senegal among a group called Indophiles, who are in love with all things in Indian, including Indian dancing, Indian films, Indian cuisine, Indian dress, and so on. So that was a very unusual example of the popularity of Hindi films or Bollywood films in a nation which did not have an Indian diaspora. Now, we are not sure about what is the percentage of, when we say we are talking about India's soft power and we are talking about Bollywood as Indian films or Bollywood films as constituting India's soft power, which the former Prime Minister grudgingly expressed in one of his lectures, that this disavowed culture of India, this disavowed cinema of India has now part of India's attractiveness to the rest of the world. The state is forced to take notice of it, surely because of the power that films have for a number of ethnic groups across the globe. But one is still not sure what is the percentage of Bollywood's share in the global market. We are aware, we can certainly say that it's the source of an attractiveness of Bollywood films to certain groups. It certainly constitutes, it's very attractive to certain groups. But can this attractiveness translate into soft power is another question altogether. Now, soft power, as Nai points out, is more effective because it's projected without a propagandist agenda. The absence of an overt propagandist intention on the part of the Indian state makes Bollywood a classic illustration of Nai's notion of soft power, because this was not something which was cultivated consciously by the Indian state through providing financial support to the film industry or by facilitating cultural exchanges. It might have done it to a limited extent, but the focus of the Indian state has been on the promotion of art house cinema in film festivals or festivals of India and so on, rather than commercial cinema. But there must have been some promotion by the state during the 50s and 60s, which explains the film stars, the popular film actors Raj Kapoor and Nargis Dutt accompanying the first Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, to Russia, and they're becoming household names in Russia. So there must have been some intervention, some encouragement by the state, but we do not have concrete figures. So this idea of the intentional fallacy of imposing Indian cultural values or South Asian cultural values on the rest of the world is demystified by the idea of Indian commercial cinema and the commercial cinema as only entertainment, because Indian commercial cinema is driven by the market and its attractiveness is through the market and in spite of the market. So Bollywood gets what it wants not only by consciously altering the behavior of others, but by its ability to attract diverse audience across different continents merely by its soft power. So this belated recognition of Bollywood's soft power came from Virendra Gupta, who says that the new overseas centers fall within the matrix of our overall foreign policy, in which soft power culture is a major component, and the expansion of cultural presence is one of the new goals of India's foreign policy. Now, who's watching Bollywood films and where? Due to the unconventional dissemination media and exhibition spaces through which Bollywood films continue to invade unimaginable spaces, official figures on their distribution and screening cannot serve as reliable guides for the projection of their soft power. So, if you were to look at the abysmal quantitative figures, data on how many people are watching Bollywood films and what was the export of Indian films over nearly a century, we would not really get the right figures, because as we have seen that Indian films leak through unofficial channels which were not supported by the state and which were not formal and which lie on the cusp of legality and illegality. So, the symbolic importance of Indian films, we can say, far exceeded the number of films exported even in the 50s. And how is this? So, what is the problem with soft power? Soft power is difficult to quantify and it works in unexpected ways. It must be married to hard power. So, it's Indian films, we can say, are attractive beyond doubt. The ability of the attractiveness of the ideology of the Hindi film to set the political agenda and determine the framework of debate in a way that shapes others' preferences is corroborated by recent research, such as Brian Larkin's research in parts of Africa among the Hausa youth, Muslim Hausa youth in Africa, who seem to prefer Bollywood films to Hollywood films because it gives them a template, a model for forming what Larkin calls parallel modernities, modernities which are not shaped in conjunction with the modernities projected in American or Western modernities showcased or underpinning the Hollywood film, but other kinds of modernities which may be emulated by people in the post-colonial world, such as Nigeria or even Pakistan, where there is a disidentification in identification, while Muslim youth in Pakistan would disidentify with the Hindu ideology of the Hindi films. They still identify with the kind of modernity which marries traditional values with modern Western values. They would identify with this to form a new form of Pakistani modernity. So, one of the main forms that soft power assumes is ideology, and we can look at the relationship between the ideology of Hindi cinema and its rising soft power. It's attractive, no doubt, but why do people find Bollywood films attractive? Considering that commercial Bollywood filmmakers are not driven by any political agendas or ideological imperatives, and the desire to control nothing other than entertainment industry nationally or internationally, it's more important to investigate the source of Bollywood's attractiveness to a significant proportion of the world's population. So, why are different people attracted to Bollywood films? How's our youth in Nigeria to form parallel modernities, as Larkin pointed out, through their identification with the modernity projected in Indian films, while they might disidentify with the Hindu ideologies, the Muslim youth in Pakistan, for instance. And we have another set of people. So, beginning with the attractiveness of Indian films for Hausa youth in Nigeria, we move to the attractiveness of Shahrukh Khan films or new Bollywood films, particularly Shahrukh Khan films in Germany, because of their exotic appeal, because of the techno nostalgia of post-industrial societies such as Germany for rustic cultures which are depicted often depicted in many of these films, or more so for the attraction of Hindu family values in nations where family values are breaking down. Can attractiveness translate into soft power? Now, that's a question I leave you with. The inability of films to intervene in international relations. Have they really changed? Has soft power, has the attractiveness of Indian soft power of Bollywood films to Pakistani youth have really improved the relations between India and Pakistan, though that's the aspiration on both sides of the border? Have they really ended cross-border terrorism? There seems to be a contradictory trend. So, what one needs to do is to marry soft power with hard power, which Nye defines as smart power in the modification of his original idea of soft power. Now, I leave you with another, we conclude with this.
Music for you. Did you see the film?
What?
That film?
Yeah, I see film in TV. I like Shahrukh Khan, I like Angelina, Kajol.
My name Anjali, you see? Really? My name Anjali.
Yeah.
Karina? You like Karina?
Yeah, I like also in artist India.
Who all do you like?
But I like Shahrukh Khan.
Shahrukh Khan.
Yeah.
Which film? You sing for us, we'll take your song to Shahrukh Khan.
Baru Shahrukh Khan apa? Dooms. In
Doom
film
is not
Dooms.
Shahrukh Khan. Hrithik Roshan.
Normal ni.
Hrithik Roshan, John
Yeah, tu bu.
If you sing, we go and tell Shahrukh Khan that she likes you. What's your name?
Komang.
Komang.
Yeah.
Okay. Really, we know somebody who knows Shahrukh Khan.
Handsome.
Handsome.
Yeah.
What's your name? Ilu.
Yeah.
You think he's handsome? How old are you?
And 13 years.
13 years old. And where did you see Shahrukh Khan?
Yeah, I like Shahrukh Khan.
You like Shahrukh Khan?
I like Shahrukh Khan, Angelina, Kajol.
Kajol?
Yeah.
Karina?
Yes, I like too, but it's very cute, so cute.
He's cute.
Yeah.
But you also cute.
Yes, ini ho gaya tera sanjana. Apa ya?
So we have 15-year-old Koma and her sister 13-year-old Ilu in a shrine, these teenage souvenir sellers in a shrine in Bali, who shared with their German counterparts their love for Shahrukh Khan. They believe he's extremely handsome, and they also know all the names of all the Hindi film actors. So there's a class divide, there's a regional divide. From the global north we move to the global south, but the what is common is the love for Shahrukh Khan in among people of different classes, genders, nationalities across the world. From Koma in Bali to Michelle in Australia and young women in Germany, all seem to be big fans of Shahrukh Khan. Will this really translate into smart power? We don't know, but Bollywood films are certainly attractive to a large number of people in the world.